Today we are going to explore one of the great mysteries of ancient construction: how medieval builders managed to create wooden structures that last more than 8 centuries, while modern wood begins to warp in a matter of weeks. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. Somewhere in Europe, a roof beam rests silent high in a cathedral. It has been there for 800 years. It has crossed wars, storms, fires, and the relentless passage of time. And here is the most intriguing detail. This beam is stronger today than on the day it was installed. Meanwhile, in garages and warehouses around the world, boards bought only a few weeks ago already show cracks, twists, and deformations visible to the naked eye. Something does not make sense in this equation. Medieval builders did not possess electric saws, did not have access to sophisticated chemical treatments, did not have laboratories to test the resistance of materials. They worked with hand tools, knowledge passed down from generation to generation, and a deep understanding of nature that somehow was lost over the centuries. The question that imposes itself is inevitable. What did these artisans know about wood that we, with all our modern technology, have apparently forgotten? To answer this question, we first need to understand how medieval woodcutters and carpenters selected their trees. And here begins a fascinating journey through ancestral knowledge that transformed the choice of a simple tree into a precise and almost ritualistic science. Medieval woodcutters did not simply fell trees, they diagnosed them. Before any axe touched the bark, these professionals circled the tree like a doctor examining a patient. They observed the bark patterns with meticulous attention, studied the angles of the branches, analyzed how the canopy sat upon the trunk. Every detail told a story about what was hidden inside that wood. A crooked tree, for example, was an immediate warning sign. This meant that the internal grains probably followed a twisted pattern, and twisted grains in a roof beam represented a collapse waiting to happen. Decades later, under the constant pressure of the structure's weight, this internal twist could cause a catastrophic failure. Medieval builders understood this intuitively. There was also a particularly interesting technique that reveals the sophistication of this ancestral knowledge. The woodcutters knocked on the trunk with their knuckles and listened carefully to the sound produced. A clear and resonant sound indicated dense and healthy wood. A dull thud, on the other hand, denounced problems invisible to the eye: internal rot, hollow cores, structural defects that completely compromised the integrity of the wood. It was impossible to see these problems just by observing the exterior of the tree, but it was perfectly possible to detect them through sound, if you knew what you were listening for. This acoustic principle, moreover, survives to this day in completely different contexts. Many people still choose watermelons at the supermarket by knocking on them and listening to the sound, the same physical principle in action, only with much less dramatic consequences. The location of the trees played an equally crucial role in this selection process. Trees that grew on north-facing slopes were considered true treasures. The reason for this was directly linked to the physics of plant growth. With less exposure to direct sunlight, these trees grew more slowly, which meant that their growth rings formed much closer to each other. We are talking about a significant difference, approximately 40 rings per inch in a slow-growing tree, compared to perhaps 8 rings per inch in a fast-growing tree on a sunny south-facing slope. This difference in ring density translated directly into a difference in strength. Denser wood was simply stronger, more durable, more capable of supporting heavy loads for long periods. Trees struck by lightning were completely avoided, as were those that showed signs of damage caused by fire. Medieval builders understood that physical traumas created internal stress fractures in the wood. A beam cut from a traumatized tree could look absolutely perfect on the outside. It could be installed, it could support weight for years, perhaps decades, and then, 20 or 30 years later, without prior warning, it would crack under load. The result could be catastrophic: roofs caving in, structures collapsing, lives lost. To avoid this risk, wood selectors simply passed over any tree that showed signs of past trauma. The most skilled wood selectors developed an almost supernatural ability to predict how long a beam would last. Their predictions were made with a margin of decades, not years. And the most impressive thing is that some of their choices still support roofs 800 years later. 800 years. It is a period of time almost impossible to comprehend in human terms. Empires rose and fell, languages were born and died, the world transformed itself completely multiple times, and the beams that these artisans selected remain firm, fulfilling their function with the same reliability as always. Compare this with the modern experience, lumber yards that sell boards by dimension and price, without any consideration for the individual history of each tree. No one matches specific trees with specific jobs anymore. No one reads wood like those artisans knew how to do. But selecting the right tree was only half of the equation. The moment you felled it changed absolutely everything. And it is here that we enter territory that might sound strange to modern ears, but which has been confirmed by recent scientific research. You have probably heard somewhere that medieval builders felled trees according to the phases of the moon. At first glance, this sounds like pure superstition, the kind of thing an eccentric uncle would mention after a few beers. Something to be discarded as folklore without scientific foundation, except it isn't. German forest researchers actually tested this practice in controlled studies, and the results were surprising. Trees cut during the waning moon, the period between the full moon and the new moon, contain between 4 and 5% less moisture than trees cut in other lunar phases. This difference might not seem very significant at first glance. 4 or 5% is a small number in many contexts, but when you are working with wood that needs to dry for years before being used, this initial advantage becomes enormously relevant. Wood that is drier from the start reaches the ideal drying point much faster. It is less prone to developing problems during the curing process. It begins its journey in much more favorable conditions. But why does this happen? The explanation lies in the same force that moves ocean tides, the gravitational pull of the moon. During certain lunar phases, the sap of the trees is pulled toward the roots with greater intensity. Cut the tree at that moment, and you will be harvesting wood that is already naturally drier from day one. The records of the medieval guilds did not treat this practice as optional advice or interesting folklore wisdom. They specified exact felling dates. Violating these rules could result in expulsion from the trade organization. Your entire career could end because of the moment of the moon in which you felled a tree. This demonstrates how seriously they took this knowledge, and they accumulated advantages. Felling in winter added another layer of protection. During the months of dormancy, the trees had already naturally pulled most of the moisture from their outer wood to the roots, where it was stored until spring. So felling during the winter, during a waning moon, meant starting with the driest wood possible. It was a combination of factors that optimized conditions from the first moment. Now consider the contrast with the modern timber industry. Commercial extraction operates all year round, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. What determines when a tree is felled is not the phase of the moon or the season of the year, but rather operational efficiency. What keeps the sawmills fed? What maximizes production? What generates more profit in less time? The result is that wood arrives at construction sites already prepared for problems, warping, cracking, early deterioration, all of this even before it is installed. We traded a free calendar in the sky for the headaches of kiln-dried wood. But the moment of felling was only the beginning. What medieval builders did with the freshly cut green wood is where they truly demonstrated their mastery. Green wood, freshly taken from the tree, with sap still running. Most people today would call this an error, unusable, too wet. Return it to the supplier. Medieval carpenters, however, called this perfect, and here is why this approach was genius instead of stupid. Green wood works like butter. You can shape joints with hand tools in half the time. Try doing the same with kiln-dried oak, and you will wear out 3 chisels before lunch. The fibers of dry wood are much more resistant to cutting, much harder to work with precision. But the true magic happened after assembly. All wood shrinks as it dries. This is common knowledge. What medieval builders understood was the direction of this shrinkage. Wood shrinks approximately twice as much around its growth rings as it does along its length. They used this physics as a working tool. They cut the mortise and tenon joints slightly oversized. They inserted an oak peg. They waited 50 years. What happened then? The wood compressed. The fibers locked into each other. The joint became stronger over time, not weaker. It was as if the building was slowly giving itself a permanent hug. There are joints from the 14th century that you could not pull apart even with a crowbar. Not because someone glued them with some magical adhesive, but because the wood spent centuries tightening itself more and more. This technique required serious mathematical skills. It was necessary to calculate exactly how much contraction would occur over time. Calculating wrong meant gaps appearing in the joints. Calculating right meant that physics did the fastening work permanently, without the need for nails, screws, or glue. Modern construction demands kiln-dried wood because it is predictable, uniform, fast. But kiln drying essentially cooks the wood at high temperatures. The cells do not have time to relax gradually. Internal tensions accumulate with no way to dissipate. Then, cracks appear. These cracks have a technical name, checks, and checks become highways for water and insects to penetrate the heart of the wood. Medieval green wood construction avoided this problem almost entirely. But there was something that truly separated medieval methods from ours: how long they were willing to wait. This is where medieval builders begin to look less like carpenters and more like wine collectors. Properly air-drying oak takes approximately 1 year per inch of thickness. Let that information sink in for a moment. A 12-inch thick beam would need more than a decade just sitting in a yard, waiting. And they actually did this. The roof of Notre Dame used trees felled 50 to 80 years before anyone hammered them into position. Cathedral projects routinely stockpiled wood, knowing that their grandchildren would be the ones responsible for installing it. This is a type of long-term planning that seems almost incomprehensible in the modern world, where we can barely commit to a television series. But here is why this mattered so much. When wood dries slowly, really slowly, the cells inside it have time to relax. They adjust gradually to the new state. There is no accumulation of internal tension. There are no stress fractures waiting to surprise you decades later. Compare this with kiln drying. Modern kilns bombard the wood with heat and have it ready in days instead of years. Efficient? Absolutely. But you are essentially cooking the cellular structure of the wood. It is like the difference between slow roasting a cut of meat and putting it in the microwave. Technically, both are cooked. One falls apart beautifully in the mouth, the other turns into a shoe sole. The stacking method also mattered enormously. The wood was placed on elevated platforms with spaces between each board. Everything was arranged so that the prevailing winds flowed through the stack evenly, not stacked randomly in any old way. It was engineered airflow, engineering applied to natural drying. And the difference in strength is measurable. Air-dried oak tests 20 to 30% stronger than kiln-dried oak of the same species and grade, the same tree, the same wood. Completely different performance. The cell walls remain intact instead of suffering heat damage. We traded patience for speed, and our buildings became weaker because of it. But slow drying was only part of the strategy. Medieval builders also understood something about wood species that modern builders completely ignore. And this explains why some medieval structures survived while others rotted in a few years. Oak went where the weight was. Pillars, beams, anything supporting serious compression loads. But there was an important bonus. Oak naturally contains tannic acid. Insects loathe this substance. Fungi cannot establish themselves. A single wood solving two problems simultaneously. Elm went into underwater applications. Its grains interlock so tightly that you practically cannot split the wood even if you try. Water wheels, ship keels, well linings. Anywhere wood met water for decades, elm was the answer. Try splitting elm firewood someday, and you will understand why they chose it for wet applications. The interlocking structure of the grains resists separation in a way that other woods simply cannot match. And there is the chestnut. And this choice still provokes admiration when you understand the logic behind it. They used chestnut for roof structures because spiders avoid this wood. The tannins repel insects, which means there are no webs accumulating in those magnificent vaulted cathedral ceilings. Medieval builders solving a cleaning problem through material selection. This is thinking ahead in an impressive way. Ash became every tool handle and weapon shaft in Europe. Why? The long fibers absorb impact without splintering. When a Viking warrior swung an axe and hit a shield, that ash handle prevented his hands from going numb. The same reason why baseball bats used ash for 100 years. Yew was perfect for longbows. Not because it was flexible, but because the central part and the outer part of the wood behave in completely different ways. The heartwood compresses in the belly of the bow, while the sapwood stretches on the back. A single piece of wood performing two opposing jobs simultaneously. English archers won battles because someone, centuries before, noticed how yew behaves under tension. Now look at modern construction. We use whatever pine grows fastest in commercial plantations. Softwood, weak, identical, going into decks, structures, furniture, fences. The same species for completely different jobs with completely different requirements. Does it make sense? Not really, it makes profit. But there is something even more interesting to explore. Medieval preservation methods were basically chemistry before anyone called it chemistry. This is where medieval builders begin to look like eccentric scientists. They discovered serious chemistry centuries before chemistry existed as a formal discipline. And honestly, some of their methods sound completely insane until you realize they actually work. Consider water preservation. Sounds contradictory, doesn't it? Using water to protect wood from water damage. But medieval artisans submerged their timbers in running streams for months. Not stagnant water, running water. The constant flow extracted all the sugars and starches that fungi and insects actually consume as food. What remained was pure cellulose, wood fiber that was basically indigestible and that nothing wanted to consume. Wood treated this way was much less attractive to the organisms that normally destroy it. And there is bog oak. Pull a log out of an Irish peat bog after 5,000 years, and it is still workable. The combination of the absence of oxygen and tannic acid essentially preserved the wood like a cucumber in brine. Pieces of this material exist in collections around the world, black as coal, hard as iron, and older than the pyramids of Egypt. It is an extraordinary testament to the power of natural preservation methods. There is also a favorite technique among naval construction historians. Medieval shipbuilders deliberately set fire to their entire planks. They charred the surface until it turned into charcoal. This blackened layer became a barrier that insects could not digest and water could not penetrate, fighting fire with fire, literally. And the ends of the beams received special attention. The builders knew that the end grain absorbs moisture 200 times faster than the side grain, so they rubbed linseed oil into every exposed end. Simple solution, huge results. And there are practices that might seem strange to modern sensibilities. Some builders buried their timbers in manure piles. Yes, manure. The ammonia from decomposition penetrated deep into the wood and acted as a powerful fungicide. The smell was terrible. The result was beautiful. Wood preserved this way resisted decay in impressive ways. Modern pressure-treated wood uses chromated copper arsenate. Effective for sure, but it releases toxic chemicals into the soil and becomes hazardous waste after demolition. Medieval builders used fish oil and cow manure. We use poison. It is a comparison that invites reflection on what progress truly means. But preservation only works if the design of the building cooperates. There is something that takes time to fully understand. Medieval buildings were not just built well, they were designed to allow the wood to do what wood naturally does: breathe. The builders left deliberate air gaps behind the wall timbers, not because they were lazy or careless, but because they knew that trapped moisture kills wood faster than direct rain ever could. A beam that gets wet and then dries, no problem. A beam that stays slightly damp for years rots until it turns to paste. And those huge eaves you see in old structures, those were not decorative. They extended a meter or more specifically to keep rain splashes away from the foundation timbers. Water bouncing off the ground was the enemy, and they built armor against it. There was also the stone plinth trick. Ground floor beams sat on elevated stone platforms, sometimes only 10 centimeters of separation between the wood and the damp earth. 10 centimeters. This small gap saved entire buildings for centuries by keeping the structural wood away from the constant moisture of the soil. The placements of windows and doors were not random. They created cross-ventilation that continuously moved air past the structural timbers. Constant airflow meant no condensation buildup. No condensation meant no rot. Every element of the design worked together to keep the wood dry and healthy. Now compare this with modern construction. We wrap our walls in plastic vapor barriers, thinking we are protecting the wood. Instead, we are suffocating it. We create exactly the stagnant, humid environment that destroys wood most rapidly. A 2019 study examined modern houses with structural problems. 68% of the damage to structural wood occurred in walls where moisture became trapped by plastic lining. We literally engineered the problem we are trying to avoid. Medieval builders engineered drainage and airflow into every structure. We engineer moisture traps and call it progress, but wood that breathes was only half of their strategy. The other half involved eliminating something that we now put by the thousands in every house. This is where medieval builders really demonstrated their ingenuity. And honestly, it is the part that makes modern construction look a bit embarrassing. Iron nails rust, everyone knows that. But here is what most people don't think about. When iron rusts, it expands. This expansion cracks the wood around it, and every nail hole becomes a small funnel, channeling water directly into the core of the wood. Medieval builders looked at metal fasteners and basically said, "No, thank you." Instead, they used wooden pegs called tree nails. And here is the clever part. They made these pegs from wood that was drier than the beams they were joining. So, when the humidity increased, the pegs absorbed moisture and swelled. The joint became tighter over time, not looser. Try that with a metal nail. There were also splice joints. These connected timbers end to end using interlocking wedge shapes. The brilliant part was that they tightened under load. The heavier the roof, the stronger the connection. It was as if the building were designed to hug itself together. There are mortise and tenon joints in 400-year-old furniture that still work perfectly. Meanwhile, bookshelves assembled with nails that were bought just a few years ago already wobble like a nervous dog. The difference lies in the materials and methods used to join the pieces. But the true magic appeared during earthquakes. Medieval wooden structures used no glue. None. Even so, they survived centuries of seismic activity. Why? Because the joints flexed slightly. They absorbed energy instead of fighting it. The building bent, then returned to its original position. Modern rigid connections crack under the same conditions. Here is a number that should worry anyone interested in durable construction. The average American house contains approximately 20,000 nails, 20,000 potential rust points, 20,000 paths for moisture, 20,000 little time bombs waiting to fail over time. But eliminating metal was only half the battle. Medieval builders also understood something about the wood itself that we completely ignore: the difference between its heart and its skin. This is where medieval builders would look at a modern lumberyard and simply shake their heads in disapproval. We treat wood as if it were a uniform material. They knew better. A single tree trunk contains two completely different types of wood, and mixing them was considered the work of an amateur. The dark center of a tree is the heartwood. The pale outer rings are the sapwood. The same tree, completely different performances. The heartwood is where the tree spent decades depositing its chemical defenses. Tannins, oils, resins, all the substances that make insects say no and fungi pack their bags. The sapwood has none of that. It is basically raw, unprotected plant tissue waiting to become some organism's lunch. Medieval builders cut away every piece of sapwood before using a timber structurally. Every piece, even if it meant discarding 30 to 40% of each log. This sounds wasteful until you realize that oak heartwood resists decay 5 times better than the sapwood of the identical tree. The same species, the same forest, the same day of felling. 5 times the difference in durability and resistance to decay. And the strange part is that sapwood actually attracts trouble. It absorbs moisture faster, swells more, and contains exactly the nutrients that wood-boring beetles need to reproduce. It is basically rolling out the red carpet for everything that destroys wood. Many people learn this lesson the hard way with their first deck projects. They buy what looks like beautiful uniform wood. 3 years later, one edge of half the boards has turned to paste while the rest remains perfect. The ruined part was sapwood. Modern sawmills do not care about any of this. They cut logs to maximize board footage. Heartwood, sapwood, whatever fits. Mix it all together. But medieval builders were not just picky about which part of the tree they used. They were obsessive about who actually did the work. This is where it all connects. And honestly, it is the part that causes a certain sadness about modern construction when you stop to reflect. Medieval artisans personally guaranteed their work for a minimum of 40 years. If your beam cracked or your joint failed, you didn't just lose your job. You lost everything: your reputation, your guild membership, sometimes your entire livelihood. This is not a warranty card you throw in a drawer and forget. This is having your own skin in the game. So they built according to that personal risk. Guild systems enforced standards across generations. A master in London used the same techniques as a master in York. The same joint cuts, the same wood selection, the same quality standards. His apprentice learned exactly what you learned, and his apprentice after that. Quality was not a marketing term, it was professional survival. But here is what truly impresses when you consider the implications. A cathedral carpenter knew that his grandson might one day repair his joints. Let that idea sink in for a moment. He engraved assembly marks into his timbers that are still legible 600 years later. Still useful, still guiding repairs today. This is not ego or vanity. It is responsibility toward future generations. They also oversized everything by 30 to 50%, beyond what calculations said they needed. Why? Because they could not predict earthquakes, wars, or that future generations might hang heavier chandeliers. So they built reserves, generous safety margins just in case. Modern building codes set minimum standards for structural life of 30 to 50 years. Minimum. We are literally designing buildings to be disposable. The average American house needs significant structural repairs within 25 years of its construction. Meanwhile, medieval wooden structures routinely outlive the civilizations that built them. Greenstead Church in England has been standing since the year 1060. That is older than the English language itself in its modern form. It is older than universities, older than nations that we consider ancient today. And the wood of that structure continues to fulfill its function, supporting the roof, protecting the interior, serving the community as it has for nearly a millennium. We have not just forgotten how to build with wood in this way. We have forgotten why it mattered to build things that last. The history of medieval timber construction is ultimately a story about our relationship with time. These artisans were in no hurry. They understood that certain things cannot be rushed without consequences. Proper drying takes years, not days. Correct material selection requires deep knowledge, not just consulting a price table. Durable construction requires thinking in generations, not just in quarterly budgets. At some point along the way, we traded this wisdom for speed. We traded durability for convenience. We traded ancestral knowledge for industrial processes that prioritize efficiency over longevity. Perhaps the most important lesson that medieval builders have to teach us is not about wood itself. It is about how we choose to value our time and our resources. It is about recognizing that there are forms of knowledge that cannot be replaced by technology. It is about understanding that sometimes the old methods were not primitive. They were sophisticated in ways we have lost the ability to appreciate. Those 800-year-old beams still supporting cathedral roofs are more than historical curiosities. They are silent reminders that it is possible to build things that last, that it is possible to create with the intention that your work serves not just you but your children, grandchildren, and generations yet unborn. That patience, knowledge, and care can produce results that no amount of modern technology has managed to replicate. The next time you pass by a medieval structure still standing, perhaps you will look at it with new eyes. Every beam in that roof was selected from a specific tree, chosen for its unique characteristics. It was felled at a carefully calculated moment, worked while still green, joined with joints that tighten over time, treated with natural substances, and installed in a structure designed to let it breathe. Every decision, from the selection of the tree to the final placement, was made by someone who hoped their work would last for centuries, and in many cases, it did. This is the story of medieval wood, a story of knowledge lost and refound, of techniques that seemed like superstition until modern science confirmed them, of artisans who built as if their lives depended on it, because in a way they did, and of structures that continue to stand as a silent testament that there is another way to build, another way to relate to the materials we take from nature. If this journey through the ancestral knowledge of medieval builders has sparked your curiosity, if you found yourself questioning our modern assumptions about progress and efficiency, then perhaps there is something of value in revisiting the wisdom of the past. not to abandon modern technology, but to enrich it with the patience and care that our ancestors demonstrated. To build not just for today, but for the generations that will come after us. If you have made it this far in this narrative, it means you share this fascination for knowledge that spans centuries. Just as the medieval masters passed their wisdom from generation to generation, you can help keep this tradition of curiosity and learning alive. Subscribe to the channel to continue exploring stories like this one, where the past illuminates the present and invites us to rethink what we consider right. Leave your comment sharing what surprised you most on this journey through medieval techniques. And if this documentary touched your curiosity, in the same way that an 800-year-old beam still touches the roof of a cathedral, leave your like as an assembly mark so that others can find this knowledge too. Because some stories, just like some beams, deserve to last.